My name is Elara Vance. I keep the air breathable for 200,000 people who are too afraid to breathe. And I am the only one who knows this planet is not dead. It is just waiting for us to come home. Welcome back to Stellar Paradox, and today, the story is...
Only I can see her. The scrubber deck thrummed at a frequency Elara felt in her teeth before she heard it with her ears. She stood before the primary filtration array, palms flat against the chilled composite housing, eyes closed. To anyone else, Sector 4 was just another cathedral of humming machinery and recycled air. To Elara, it was a living lung, and she was listening to its breath. Along her collarbones and the base of her neck, the biofiltration valves pulsed in soft, rhythmic gradients of cerulean and gold. They weren't cosmetic graphs or fashion statements. They were hardwired environmental conduits, siphoning trace particulates and translating atmospheric pressure into somatic feedback. Officially, there were council-issued monitors, calibrated to flash amber when toxicity breached tolerance and green when the scrubbers held the line. Unofficially, Elara had spliced them into a black market neural tap buried deep in her auditory cortex. The council called it unregulated sensory drift. Elara called it the only way to hear what the dashboards lied about. Behind her, the main control terminal projected holographic readouts in sterile green and white. O saturation, 94.2%. Toxic load within tolerance. Descent protocols suspended. Evacuation readiness, Tier 3. The numbers were clean, perfect, and completely detached from the truth. Elara's colleagues trusted the screens. They adjusted dials based on predictive algorithms, logged compliance reports, and went home to their pressurized quarters. They didn't feel the subtle drag in the intake vents, the microscopic hesitation in the scrubber cycles, the way the city's weight shifted when the wind shear hit the lower hull. Elara felt it all. It made her exceptional at her job. It also made her a ghost among her own kind. The anomaly started as a tremor in the static. Her neural tap spiked, a sudden heat blooming at the base of her skull. Elara's eyes snapped open. The holographic display hadn't changed. All systems nominal. But her valves were thrumming out of sequence, syncing to a rhythm that didn't match the city's artificial circulatory system. She closed her eyes again, letting the synaptic feed wash over her. The pressure matrix fractured. Beneath the engineered hum of the scrubbers, something else surfaced. Not random noise, not a glitch, a pattern, coherent, deliberate. It formed in her mind's eye before it registered as sound, a silhouette woven from ionized air and refracted light, standing at the edge of the data stream. Tall, weightless. Her eyes were closed, but Elara felt them looking straight through the terminal, straight through the hull, straight into the swirling ochre and violet miasma that choked the world below. Elara. The word wasn't spoken. It was a frequency shift, a compression of air that vibrated against her eardrums and settled in her chest like a dropped stone. Elara staggered back, her palms slipping off the housing. Her breath hitched. The valves along her neck flared hot, then cooled, pulsing in a slow, deliberate cadence that matched the signal exactly. Vance? She turned. Kiel, the shift supervisor, was watching her from the adjacent console, brow furrowed. Your biometrics just spiked. You running another uncalibrated sync. Just a feedback loop, Elara said, forcing her voice steady. She tapped the command into her wrist pad, masking the neural surge as a routine pressure test. Intake valve 3 is sticking. I'm compensating. Kiel glanced at the main screen. Readouts flat. You sure you're not pushing the tap too hard? Council's been cracking down on unsanctioned neural load. You keep tripping the safety thresholds. They'll rip that mod out and reassign you to surface-adjacent monitoring. You know how that ends. Elara did know. Engineers who chased ghosts in the static usually ended up with cognitive dampeners, stripped of their clearances, or quietly transferred to the lower decks where the air was thick and the questions were fewer. I know the limits, she muttered, turning back to the array. But her hands were trembling. A feedback loop. That's what she told herself. That's what the logs would say if anyone ever checked the raw feed. Neural degradation. Synaptic echo. The mind playing tricks in a sealed environment. It had happened before. The council had protocols for it, mandatory rest cycles, psychological evaluations, sometimes permanent reassignment. They treated perception like a resource to be rationed, just like water and oxygen. But this wasn't stress. This was structure. Elara isolated the frequency, routing it through a secondary buffer. The silhouette didn't fade. It stabilized. The rhythm in her valves matched it perfectly, note for note, pressure drop for pressure drop. The data wasn't corrupted. It was clean. It was just hidden behind layers of council filtering algorithms, buried under decades of mandated ignorance. She could feel it now, a subtle shift in the atmospheric gradient, a microscopic realignment in the pressure differential that the official sensors were programmed to ignore. The city wasn't just maintaining altitude. It was being pulled. She glanced at the reinforced observation glass. Beyond it, Ethelgard Drift hung suspended in the stratosphere, a glittering archipelago of titanium and polymer, tethered to nothing but thrusters and arrogance. Below, the toxic miasma churned, a living ocean of ash and chemical runoff that had swallowed the surface centuries ago. The official doctrine was simple, drilled into every citizen since childhood: preserve the float. Ignore the fall. The planet was dead. The atmosphere was poison. Descent was suicide. The Council's long-term strategy was clear: maintain orbit, ration resources, and wait for the corporate arcologies to finish construction. Then they'd leave the dead world behind. Then why did the signal feel like a breath? Elara's fingers flew across the terminal, bypassing the Council's telemetry filters. She downloaded the raw atmospheric feed into a private drive, encrypting it with a biometric key only her neural tap could unlock. The moment the transfer completed, the official dashboard refreshed, all systems nominal. The green text glowed, smug and absolute. But the air in the scrubber deck had changed. The hum was deeper, the pressure was lighter, and for the first time in years, the valves along her neck weren't just monitoring the city. They were listening to something else. Elara pressed her palm against the cold glass again, watching the violet clouds swirl below. The silhouette lingered at the edge of her vision, patient and impossible. "What are you?" she whispered. The valves pulsed, once, twice. A reply in the static, and somewhere deep in the city's underbelly, a sealed hatch groaned. The groan wasn't metal, it was pressure. A deep tectonic sigh that traveled through the deck plating and vibrated in Elara's molars before the warning klaxon even registered. Sector 7's atmospheric shear had just breached tolerance. On the main console, the pressure graph jagged into crimson. Emergency strips flickered. The hum of the primary recyclers stuttered, then dipped into a strained, oscillating whine that made the air feel thin and metallic. Elara didn't need the screen. Her valves were screaming. Heat flooded her collarbones, spreading down her sternum in rapid, arrhythmic pulses. She slammed a hand on the emergency dampener, but the feedback loop had already bypassed standard routing. The neural tap at the base of her skull ignited. Not pain, pressure, a sudden crushing clarity that shattered the static like glass. Sack Elara. This time, it wasn't a frequency shift. It was a voice. Clear, resonant, carried on a draft that shouldn't exist in a sealed environment. She turned. No one was there, but the air itself seemed to bend, light refracting around an empty space near the tertiary intake. A silhouette, taller than before, defined. Her eyes were open now, pale, luminous, reflecting the flickering emergency strips. She raised a hand. The gesture wasn't directed at Elara. It was directed downward. "They're bleeding the stabilizers. You have to see." Elara grabbed the comm. "Control, this is Vance in Sector 4. I'm reading a cascading shear in 7. Primary recyclers are desyncing. Request immediate engineering override." Static crackled. Then Kale's voice, tight with professional restraint. "Copy, Vance. Telemetry's showing minor fluctuation. Stand by for auto-correction. It's not minor. The pressure matrix is fracturing. My biometrics are. Your biometrics are flagged for neural overload again." Kale cut in. "Council Directive 88 requires mandatory purge on unsanctioned sync spikes. Stand down. We're running a diagnostic." Elara stared at the console. The diagnostic progress bar crawled forward. Green, always green, even as the deck lights dimmed to amber, even as the air grew heavy with ozone and unfiltered particulates. "You're not reading the raw feed," she said quietly. "We read what the system provides, Vance. Purge initiated in 10. Clear your neural cache." The line went dead. Purge. They were going to wipe the anomaly. Erase it like a corrupted file. Sanitize the logs and file it under operator fatigue. Elara's fingers hovered over the terminal. She could feel the presence waiting, suspended in the data stream, fragile as spun glass. If she let the purge run, it would be gone. Or worse, buried so deep even her modified tap couldn't retrieve it. She didn't think. She acted. Her hands moved across the keyboard, bypassing council firewalls, diving into the unfiltered atmospheric archive. The purge countdown flashed on screen, _07006. She routed the raw feed through a secondary encryption layer, tagging it with her biometric signature. The data unfolded, not noise, not drift. A protocol, dormant, buried under decades of classified overrides and redacted maintenance logs. Descensus Protocol Theta. Shook, her breath caught. It was a descent sequence, not for evacuation, for landing. The code mapped directly to the city's primary stabilizer array, but it was inverted. The Council hadn't just suspended descent protocols. They'd actively misaligned the thruster vectors. They were bleeding altitude, slowly, deliberately. The pattern repeated, a timestamp embedded in the atmospheric shear, 14 days. At this rate, the stabilizers would fail. The city wouldn't just fall. It would tear itself apart on re-entry, crushed by the very atmosphere it was built to escape. "They're leaving you," the voice whispered, not in her ears, but in the sudden stillness between heartbeats. "But the ground is ready. Only you can read the map." And night. The purge counter hit 0. A sharp static burst echoed through her neural tap. For a second, everything went dark. Then the encrypted drive on her wrist pulsed warm. Safe. The data was hers. Elara ripped the comm patch from her shoulder. Official channels went silent. She was unregistered now. A ghost in the system. No pings. No trace. Just a woman standing in a failing scrubber deck, holding a truth that could get her killed. She grabbed her toolkit, slung it over her shoulder, and stepped toward the maintenance access shaft. The door hissed open, revealing a narrow ladder descending into shadow. The air down there was different. Older, thick with condensation and the ghost of petrichor. Her valves cooled, sinking to a slower, deeper rhythm, matching something ancient, something waiting. She didn't look back at the scrubber deck, didn't look at the green readouts lying on the screen. She placed her hand on the rungs, felt the cold metal bite into her palm, and began to climb down. The threshold wasn't a door, it was a choice. And she'd already made it. Below, the city's underbelly waited, and for the first time it was breathing back. The ladder ended in rust and shadow. Elara dropped the last meter onto a grated walkway, her boots ringing against corroded steel. The air here was different, heavier, thick with moisture and the metallic tang of oxidized copper. Above, Ethelgard drift hummed with sterile precision, a machine kept alive by algorithms and compliance. Below, it breathed. Condensation dripped from overhead conduits, pulling in cracked drainage channels that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. Bioluminescent algae clung to the bulkheads, pulsing in slow, rhythmic waves that matched the cadence in Elara's neck valves. She closed her eyes, letting the neural tap filter the ambient noise. The static was gone. In its place, a low, resonant hum, like wind through canyon stone. The pressure shifted, subtle but deliberate, tugging at her eardrums. "Follow the damp." Understir the presence seemed to whisper, not in words, but in a sudden draft that carried fine glowing spores across the walkway. Elara adjusted her grip on the toolkit and stepped off the main thoroughfare into a narrower service corridor. The walls here were scarred with old welding marks and faded hazard glyphs. Sealed bulkheads loomed ahead, their manual override wheels crusted with neglect. Official archives called this zone Quarantine Sector Theta. Her encrypted drive called it something else, /archive access. A clang echoed from the shadows. not machinery. Tools. Elara froze, hand drifting to the plasma cutter on her belt. Council patrol? She called out, voice tight. A low chuckle answered from behind a stack of corroded filtration drums. Council doesn't come down here. Too bad for the air quality. Too good for the secrets. A figure emerged, wiping grease from his hands with a stained rag. He was lean, wrapped in patched thermal layers and reinforced harnesses. His eyes were sharp, assessing, missing nothing. Name's Jax. You're either lost, dead, or the first engineer with a death wish in 20 years. Which is it? Elara didn't lower her guard. Elara Vance. Atmosphere architecture. I'm tracking a pressure anomaly. The stabilizers are misaligned. Jax's smirk faded. He tossed the rag aside. Stabilizers. You're chasing ghosts, Vance. The council sealed the lower decks after the breach. Nothing down here but rust and residual toxins. Go back up before your neural tap cooks your brain. Elara tapped her wrist drive. The encrypted projection flared to life, casting jagged green lines across the damp walls. This isn't a glitch, it's a protocol. Descensus Theta. They're bleeding altitude on purpose. Jax stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he scanned the data stream. His skepticism warred with an engineer's instinct. Where'd you pull this? That's pre-collapse encryption. Council wiped those archives. They didn't wipe them, Elara said. They buried them, and the atmosphere's trying to tell us why. As she spoke, the bioluminescent algae along the corridor brightened. A draft moved through the sealed space, carrying a sudden drop in pressure that made Elara's valves pulse in recognition. The spores settled on Jax's shoulders. He brushed them off, frowning. Spores? Down here? That's impossible. The breach sterilized this level. Did it? Elara's breath steadied. Or did it just change the rules? Jax exhaled slowly, the pragmatism in his face cracking into reluctant curiosity. He turned and gestured for her to follow. If you're going to get us both killed, you might as well see what's actually down here. He led her deeper, past collapsed catwalks and dormant hydro pumps, to a makeshift workshop bolted into the hull. Illegal moisture harvesters hummed quietly, siphoning condensation into filtered storage tanks. The air here was cool, clean, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and ozone. I've been running these for 3 years, Jax admitted, voice low. Council rations water like it's going out of style. But down here, it's everywhere. The filters barely catch anything. Makes you wonder what the toxic breach really was. He pulled up a cracked terminal, bypassing a fried relay to access old maintenance logs. Redacted files. Black bars over keywords. But one phrase survived the decades of censorship, Shio adaptive response. Surface integration successful. Evacuation protocol overridden. Jax stared at the screen. They didn't fail, he murmured. They succeeded. And then they lied about it. Elara felt it then, a pressure drop. Subtle, but deliberate. The harvester's output spiked. The algae brightened. The presence wasn't just in the data anymore. It was in the walls, in the water, in the air itself. You see it now. The resonance seemed to say, vibrating through the deck plates. Her valves cooled, no longer fighting the environment, but harmonizing with it. It's not a breach, Elara said, looking at Jax. It's a recovery. The planet didn't die, it adapted, and the Council's been suppressing the signal ever since. Jax ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the revelation settling. Quote, if you're right, they're not just hiding the truth, they're hoarding the future. He met her eyes. What do you need? Elara unclipped her toolkit. Access to the primary atmospheric spire, manual override, and a way past the Warden drones. Jax's mouth twitched into a grim smile. That'll cost you, but I know a back channel through the old terraforming rigs. Follow me. And Vance, if you're wrong about this, we're both breathing poison. I'm not wrong, Elara said, feeling the steady pulse in her neck. The air already told me. They moved deeper into the dark. 2 engineers walking away from the sky they'd been taught to fear, following a frequency only one of them could hear. The lower decks weren't a tomb. They were a threshold, and for the first time, the city below them wasn't falling. It was waiting. The silence didn't break, it shattered. A high-pitched harmonic whine sliced through the damp air, followed by the synchronized thrum of repulsor drives. Red targeting lasers cut through the condensation fog, painting jagged lines across the rusted bulkheads. Wardens, Jax hissed, dragging Elara behind a collapsed ventilation shaft. They triangulated your neural signature the second you bypassed the main grid. Elara's breath came shallow. Her valves were vibrating, not with the steady rhythm of the planet, but with the frantic, staccato pulse of threat detection. Above them, the sleek obsidian silhouettes of Council security drones glided through the service gantries, their optical sensors sweeping the darkness like searchlights. They weren't just patrolling. They were hunting. They're running a predictive sweep. Elara whispered, watching the laser grid shift. If we move now, we'll trigger the motion sensors. We don't move, Jax countered, already unspooling a thick cable from his harness. We blind them. He pointed to a junction box mounted on a corroded pillar 20 meters away. That's a local relay node. Cut the feed, and the wardens lose their local mesh. They'll have to revert to orbital uplink. Gives us a 4-minute window. 4 minutes isn't enough to reach the spire access, Elara argued, though her hands were already checking her plasma cutter. It's enough to get to the old terraforming archives. Jax shot back. Your ghost keeps pulling us toward the lower foundation. If there's a truth down here, it's in those servers. But Vance. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight. Chasing phantoms in the static gets engineers killed. I've seen good people fry their neural cortexes trying to talk to machines that don't talk back. Are you sure this isn't just your implant degrading? Elara looked at him, then past him into the fog. The presence wasn't in the machines. It was in the space between them. Trust the current. The resonance whispered, cool and steady against the panic in her chest. Her valves synced to it, calming the frantic tremor. I'm sure, she said, pulling free. Cover me. She darted across the open grate. The warden's sensors whirred, tracking her thermal signature. Jax triggered a diversion charge on the opposite wall. Sparks erupted, drawing 2 drones away. Elara reached the junction box, sliced the housing, and yanked the primary data conduit. The relay sparked, died, and the red targeting lasers flickered out. The wardens hovered, confused, their formation breaking as they switched to backup protocols. Move, Jax yelled. They scrambled through a service hatch just as the drones recalibrated, their repulsors kicking up a storm of rust and condensation. They dropped into a cavernous sublevel, far below the maintenance grids. The air here was still, preserved. Rows of dormant server racks stood like monoliths, coated in decades of dust but structurally intact. At the center, a single terminal glowed, with a faint, amber standby light. Elara approached it, her neural tap already reaching out. The moment her fingers brushed the interface, the terminal flared to life. Not with Council encryption, with something older, raw, unfiltered. Data flooded her mind. Not numbers, memories, pre-collapse atmospheric logs, terraforming schematics, ecological surveys. She saw the planet before the float vibrant, breathing, alive. Then the Council's original mandate, Schlack forced atmospheric override, rapid industrialization, biosphere suppression. The toxicity wasn't a natural disaster. It was an immune response. The planet had fought back against the chemical bombardment, evolving extremophile ecosystems, sealing its wounds behind layers of adaptive miasma. The breach wasn't a failure. It was a victory. The surface had healed. The Council had just refused to look down. Elara gasped, staggering back. The implant at the base of her skull seared hot. Warning glyphs flashed across her vision, but they were being overwritten by something else. The line between data and reality dissolved. She could taste ozone and petrichor on her tongue. She could hear wind rushing through canopies that hadn't existed for centuries. The hum of the servers merged with the sound of rain hitting soil. Vance, Jax's voice was distant, muffled by the storm in her head. He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. Your biometrics are spiking. The implant's overheating. We need to disconnect you. No. Elara choked out, her eyes wide, reflecting the amber light. It's not overheating. It's sinking. Too fast. The data isn't corrupted. It's alive. She looked at her hands, The biofiltration valves along her neck were glowing bright gold, pulsing in time with the terminal's heartbeat. They didn't just hide the recovery jacks. They're terrified of it. Because if the planet is alive, thus if their entire doctrine is a lie. The terminal screen flickered, displaying a single, repeating coordinate. Deep in the foundation, directly beneath the atmospheric spire. "Sir, come." The voice resonated, no longer a whisper, but a presence that filled the room. "See what they buried." Elia's vision cleared, but the sensory echo remained. The air felt heavier, charged with purpose. Jax was staring at her, fear and awe warring in his expression. "You're bleeding light from your neck ports," he muttered, "and you're talking to a hard drive like it's a person." "Maybe it is," Elara said, wiping sweat from her brow. Her hands were steady now. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "The wardens will be back online in 3 minutes. We have the truth. Now we need to prove it." She turned toward the darkness beyond the server racks, where a narrow maintenance tunnel led deeper into the planet's crust. The coordinate pulsed in her mind. The path was clear, but so was the danger. They weren't just running from drones anymore. They were carrying a revelation that could shatter a civilization. And the Council would burn the lower decks to keep it buried. "Ready?" Jax asked, hefting his toolkit like a weapon. Elara nodded, feeling the steady, ancient rhythm in her valves. "Let's go wake the world." The maintenance tunnel narrowed into a throat of raw basalt and woven carbon fiber. The air grew still, heavy with a silence that felt less like absence and more like held breath. Elara's valves pulsed in a slow, steady cadence, no longer fighting the environment but matching it. Jax walked a half step behind, his boots careful on the uneven grating, his eyes fixed on the terminal strapped to Elara's wrist. The coordinate had stopped blinking. It was a constant, warm pulse now. "We're at the foundation seam," Jax murmured. "Structural integrity's at 40%. If the Council really sealed this level, they didn't just lock a door. They buried a vault." Elara didn't answer. She was already reaching out. Not with her hands, with her mind. She pressed her palm against the cold rock wall. The neural tap at the base of her skull flared. But this time, there was no resistance. No static. No Council filters. The connection snapped into place like a magnetic lock engaging. The world dissolved into light and pressure. "You stopped running." The voice wasn't in her ears. It was in her marrow. It resonated through her biofiltration valves, through her ribcage, through the blood in her veins. Elara gasped, her knees buckling. Jax caught her shoulder, but she shook him off, eyes wide, fixed on nothing and everything. The chamber around them seemed to respond. Condensation beaded on the walls, tracing fractal patterns that matched the rhythm in her neck. The air grew cool, carrying the faint, impossible scent of damp soil and crushed pine. "I am not a glitch." Wissit, the presence continued, calm and vast as a weather front. "I am the echo of what you tried to bury. The air is healing. You are the only one who stopped filtering me out." Images flooded her, not data streams, but memories of wind-shaping dunes, of roots cracking stone, of atmospheric particulates bonding into living soil. The toxicity hadn't been a death rattle. It had been a cocoon, a planetary immune response to centuries of chemical bombardment. And now, beneath the miasma, the biosphere was breathing again. Elara forced air into her lungs. "The Council, they know. They've always known." "They know," she confirmed. "And they are leaving." "See." The terminal on Elara's wrist projected a new schematic. Not a recovery log, a migration blueprint. Orbital arcologies. Corporate contracts. Evacuation manifest dated for 14 days from now. The Council wasn't maintaining the city. They were draining it. The stabilizer misalignment wasn't an accident or a cover-up. It was a countdown. A deliberate, controlled bleed designed to force a mass descent precisely when the corporate shuttles would be ready to harvest the surviving population and abandon the surface to reset over centuries. "They're not just hiding the truth," Elara whispered, the horror crystallizing into cold fury. "They're selling the exodus, the city's altitude loss. It's scheduled. They're manufacturing a crisis to justify abandonment." Jack stared at the projection, his face pale. They'd let 200,000 people choke on re-entry, just to meet a corporate deadline. That's not governance. That's a liquidation sale. The stabilizers are locked to a council override, Sir the Presence murmured, her tone shifting from revelation to directive. They cannot be corrected from the bridge. The alignment must be manual, at the atmospheric spire, from the primary convergence chamber. Elara's mind raced. The spire was the heart of Ethelgard Drift, heavily fortified, monitored by Warden AI. Access required biometric clearance she no longer possessed, and manual realignment meant physically overriding the thruster vectors while the city was actively fighting to maintain its doomed trajectory. The misalignment wasn't just a throttle issue. It was a hard-coded feedback loop embedded in the council's evacuation algorithm. Breaking it required rerouting the city's entire atmospheric grid through a single operator's neural signature. One miscalculation wouldn't just fail. It would tear the hull apart. It's a suicide run, Jax said quietly. Even if we breach the spire, the neural load will fry your implant. Maybe you. Elara looked at her hands. The valves along her neck were glowing steady gold, no longer just monitors, but conduits. She felt the planet's rhythm in her pulse. She felt the city's strain in her bones. The fear was still there, but it had been burned away by something heavier: responsibility. She had spent her life listening to machines that lied. Now, for the first time, she was hearing something true. They built this city to float above the world, she said, voice low but firm. But the world isn't asking us to float it's asking us to land. She met Jax's eyes. I'm not going to hide in the static. I'm not going to let them bleed us dry for a corporate timetable. I'm going to prove she's real, and I'm going to bring us home. Jax held her gaze for a long moment. The skepticism in his face hardened into resolve. He unclipped a heavy breaching charge from his belt, checking the detonator with practiced hands. Then we don't knock. We break the door. And Vance, if you start frying, I'm pulling the plug. I'm not losing you to a ghost. Deal, Elara said, a faint smile touching her lips. She turned toward the tunnel's end, where a sealed maintenance hatch bore the faded glyph of the atmospheric spire. Her implant hummed, not with warning, but with alignment. The midpoint had passed. There was no more running, no more decoding, no more waiting for permission to see the truth. Only action. She placed her hand on the hatch wheel. It was cold, heavy, unyielding. Breathe, the presence whispered, her voice woven into the draft that slipped through the seams. I am with you. Elara turned the wheel. Metal groaned. Air hissed. And for the first time since she'd descended, she didn't just hear the world below. She answered it. The hatch didn't open to a corridor. It opened to a wall of light. Red emergency strobes sliced through the condensation fog, painting the maintenance shaft in jagged, pulsing shadows. The moment Elara crossed the threshold, the city's central grid reacted. Not with alarms, with silence. The hum of distant recyclers cut out. The ventilation fans spun down. A heavy, pressurized stillness dropped over the underbelly, followed by a voice that echoed from every comm panel, every wrist terminal, every drone speaker in the sector. Undersquack. Designation Vance, Elara. Status biohazard risk. Neural contamination detected. All access privileges revoked. Containment protocols active. Inc. The words were calm, clinical, final. Elara's wrist terminal flared crimson. Her ID tag dissolved into a quarantine flag. Heavy blast doors down the shaft slammed shut, hydraulic locks engaging with a sound like gunshots. Through the grated floor, she heard the synchronized whine of repulsor drives multiplying. Wardens, dozens of them, converging. Jax, she whispered into her comm. They've locked the grid. I'm pinned at Sector Theta's lower seam. Static crackled. Then Jax's voice, tight but steady. I see the swarm. They're funneling toward your position. I'll draw them off the eastern catwalk. You take the secondary service tunnel. It's narrow, but it bypasses the main choke point. Jax, don't. I'm not asking, Vance. Move. The line cut. Elara didn't wait. Dash carts ins harn Zaven wait carts. Dash didn't wait. She dropped into the secondary tunnel, boots slipping on damp grating as she ran. Behind her, the whine of drone drives shifted direction. A diversion. It was working. She could feel it in the pressure shifts, in the way the warden's targeting lasers swept away from her path. She pushed deeper, heart hammering, lungs burning with recycled air and adrenaline. Then the feed changed. Her neural tap, still synced to the fragmented atmospheric resonance, caught a bleed over from the Council's internal security network. Not by choice, by force. A hacked camera feed from the eastern catwalk flashed across her vision, superimposed over the tunnel walls. Jax stood in the open, arms raised, a breaching charge in one hand. Around him, 6 wardens hovered, optical sensors locked on his thermal signature. He wasn't fighting, he was buying time. Council Directive 88, a warden's synthetic voice announced. Surrender neural hardware. Compliance mandatory. Jax laughed. It was a dry, broken sound. Come and take it. He triggered the charge. The explosion wasn't large, but it was precise. A concussive wave of superheated steam and shrapnel erupted along the catwalk support struts. 2 wardens clipped by the blast spun out of control, crashing into the railing. But the others adjusted instantly. Stun bolts lanced through the steam. Blue arcs of electricity found Jax's shoulders, his chest, his neck. He convulsed, dropping to his knees, the charge clattering from his grip. Jax! Elara's voice tore from her throat, but the feed was already shifting. Council med drones descended, clamping magnetic restraints around his wrists and ankles. A compliance collar snapped onto his neck, glowing amber. Cognitive re-education transport inbound, the system announced. Neural dampening active. The feed cut to black. Elara slammed her fist against the tunnel wall. The impact barely registered. Her focus was already fracturing, because the silence wasn't just outside, it was inside. The Council hadn't just locked down the city, they'd initiated the Purge Protocol, a deep system algorithm designed to scrub anomalous data streams, overwrite rogue frequencies, and reset atmospheric telemetry to baseline. It wasn't targeting files, it was targeting far, or rather, what she was carrying. Elara, the voice splintered. Not a whisper this time. A tear. The resonance in her mind ripped apart, shredded by cascading error codes and forced synchronization loops. The presence that had felt so vast, so grounded, began to dissolve into static. Jagged, dissonant, painful. Elara fell to her knees. Her implant burned. Not heat. Fire. A white-hot lance drove through her temporal lobe, down her spine, out through her biofiltration valves. The ports along her neck flared blindingly bright, then dimmed, then flared again, pulsing in erratic, violent spasms. She gasped, clawing at her collar, but there was nothing to remove. The tap was wired into her nervous system. The purge was rewriting her synaptic pathways. Shold, Doldi, line. Shos, the voice was barely a thread now. Fading. There, deleting, the breath. Stop it. Elara gritted out, teeth clenched, sweat stinging her eyes. Don't let them erase you. But the algorithm didn't care about please. It was mathematics. It was control. Every cycle of the purge stripped another layer of coherence from the atmospheric signal. The pressure drops stopped matching her valves. The condensation on the walls stopped tracing fractal patterns. The air grew flat, sterile, dead. Through the neural feedback, through the tearing static, her terminal forced one last projection onto the tunnel wall. Not a map. A countdown. At atmospheric char collapse. 4759 to FAR 12. 4759-11. The misalignment wasn't just accelerating. It was compounding. The Council's bleed protocol had triggered a cascading stress fracture in the stabilizer array. Without manual realignment, the city wouldn't just fall. It would shear apart on re-entry, torn by its own momentum and the planet's recovering upper atmosphere. 200,000 lives. 48 hours. Elara pressed her forehead against the cold grating. Her breath came in shallow, ragged pulls. The implant's burn had dulled to a deep, throbbing ache. Her valves pulsed weakly, syncopated, struggling to find a rhythm in a world that was being systematically silenced. She was alone. Jax was gone. The resonance was fracturing. The Council had turned the city into a cage and thrown away the key. Every route to the spire was sealed. Every drone was hunting. Every algorithm was erasing the truth she'd sworn to prove. All systems nominal. This score the ghost of a council dashboard whispered in her mind. Compliance is safety. Dissent is death. Elara lifted her head. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face streaked with sweat and condensation. But her hands stopped shaking. The purge could scrub the data. It could burn the implant. It could lock the doors and collar the engineers and lie to the sky. But it couldn't change the physics. It couldn't stop the shear. And it couldn't erase what she had already felt. The planet was breathing. And she was the only one left who knew how to answer. Elara pushed herself up. Her legs trembled but held. She wiped the blood from her split lip, adjusted the toolkit on her shoulder, and looked down the dark, sealed tunnel. 48 hours. 1 spire. 0 clearance. She took a step. Then, enough. The purge could have the static. She was taking the storm. The atmospheric spire didn't look like a machine. It looked like a tombstone. Elara dragged herself up the final service ramp, her boots scraping against frost-rimed grating. The air here was thin, stripped of the damp warmth of the lower decks, replaced by the sterile, ozone-chilled breath of the upper stratosphere. Ethelgard drift groaned around her, metal stressing under the compounding shear, but the sound was distant, muffled by the high-frequency ringing in her ears. Her implant was a dead weight at the base of her skull, a cold shard of silicon that no longer sparked, no longer whispered, just silence, heavy, absolute. The maintenance hatch loomed ahead, a circular vault of brushed titanium set into the spire's foundation. At its center, a biometric interface glowed with a soft, indifferent blue. Elara wiped condensation from her visor and stepped forward, her breath pluming in the chill. She pressed her palm against the scanner. Understash clearance denied. The voice was automated, flat, final. She tried again, routing a weak, sputtering pulse from her neural tap, hoping for a residual handshake. Key clearance denied. Council override active. Quarantine protocol enforced. Score. She stepped back, shoulders slumping. The toolkit slid from her grip, clattering against the grating. She didn't pick it up. It was over. The realization didn't hit like a blow. It seeped in, cold and viscous, filling the hollow spaces the purge had carved out of her nervous system. Jax was in a re-education cell, his mind being sanded down to compliance by chemical dampeners. The atmospheric resonance was gone, scrubbed into white noise by the Council's algorithm. Her implant was fried, a dead wire in a dead network. And the hatch was locked to a clearance tier she'd lost hours ago. Elara slid down the curved metal wall until she hit the deck, pulling her knees to her chest. The countdown on her wrist terminal blinked in the periphery of her vision. Elias 31:14. So 31:13. 31 hours. Not enough time to bypass a council-grade biometric lock. Not enough time to rebuild a neural bridge. Not enough time to save 200,000 people who didn't even know they were falling. She closed her eyes. The silence inside her head was a vacuum. Had it ever been real? The question uncoiled slowly, venomous and quiet. The silhouette in the static. The voice in the pressure drops. The spores, the algae, the terraforming logs. Had it all been a feedback loop? A desperate, fracturing mind projecting meaning onto random noise. The Council's psych manuals were explicit. Prolonged exposure to unfiltered atmospheric data could induce pareidolia, auditory hallucinations, somatic delusions. She'd felt the pressure. She'd tasted the rain. But what if it was just her brain, starving for connection, inventing a ghost to keep her from drowning in the static? What if she was just a woman in a broken suit, chasing a phantom while the world ended? A sob caught in her throat, sharp and ugly. She pressed her forehead against her knees, fingers digging into her arms until the pain grounded her. The valves along her neck were dark. Cold. Useless. She was alone, hunted, broken, and completely, utterly wrong. Then, a pulse. Not in her head, in her skin. Elara froze. She lifted her head, breath hitching. The biofiltration ports along her collarbones weren't dark. They were glowing. Faintly. Steadily. A soft, golden luminescence that pulsed in a slow, deliberate rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2. She pressed her fingers to the nearest valve. It was warm, vibrating, but not with the frantic, arrhythmic spasms of the purge. This was different, deeper. It wasn't syncing with the city's artificial grid. It wasn't responding to the council's telemetry. It was syncing with the wind. Elara held her breath. The pulse continued. She exhaled slowly. The rhythm shifted, matching the subtle pressure drop as a high-altitude current swept over the spire's hull. She inhaled. The glow brightened, sinking to the intake cycle of the upper atmosphere. It wasn't machine logic. It wasn't code. It was biology. It was breath. She looked at her hands. The neural tap was dead. The terminal was useless. The council had purged every algorithm, every data stream, every digital bridge they could find. But they hadn't purged her. They couldn't. The valves weren't just monitors. They were conduits. And the conduit wasn't broken. It was just waiting for her to stop listening to the machines. "You don't need the implant," a voice whispered. Not in her ears, in her bones. Not a frequency, a resonance. Elara's eyes widened. She stood up, slowly, trembling not from fear, but from the sheer, staggering weight of the truth. The ghost hadn't vanished. She'd just been speaking a language Elara was finally learning to hear without a translator. The council's purge had stripped away the noise, the filters, the artificial layers of control. All that was left was the raw, unmediated rhythm of a living world. And Elara was built to match it. She wasn't chasing a signal. The biometric lock on the hatch wasn't a barrier. It was a test. Council clearance required digital authentication, a handshake of code and compliance. But the Spire's original architects hadn't just built machines. They'd built interfaces, living ones. The lock didn't need a password. It needed a pulse, a breath, a resonance. Elara stepped forward. She didn't raise her wrist terminal. She didn't try to route a bypass. She simply placed her bare palm flat against the cold titanium, right over the scanner. She closed her eyes. She stopped thinking, stopped calculating, stopped fighting the static. She breathed. In. The valves flared gold. The rhythm deepened, pulling from the stratosphere, from the recovering air below, from the ancient, patient heart of the planet. Out. The glow spread, tracing fractal lines up her arm, across her collarbones into the scanner itself. The blue light of the interface flickered, stuttered, then shifted, warming to match the gold in her skin. Hishgord authentication recognized. Hishgord. The voice wasn't automated anymore. It was quiet, reverent, like a door opening after centuries of silence. Hydraulic seals disengaged with a soft hiss. The hatch rotated inward, revealing a spiraling staircase bathed in the pale, ethereal light of the atmospheric spire's core. The air that rushed out wasn't sterile. It was alive, charged, singing. Elara didn't hesitate. She stepped across the threshold, leaving the static behind, leaving the doubt, leaving the ghost of who she used to be. The implant was dead. The council was blind. But she was finally awake, and the sky was waiting to be answered. The spire's core didn't hum, it breathed. Elara stepped onto the central platform, and the world expanded. Above, a dome of fractured crystal refracted stratospheric light into prismatic shafts that cut through the gloom. Below, a chasm of woven conduits, crystalline data cores, and ancient terraforming machinery spiraled into the planet's crust. This wasn't just an engineering hub, it was a cathedral. The air here was thick, charged with static and the faint, unmistakable scent of petrichor and crushed pine. Every surface vibrated at a frequency too low for human ears, but Elara felt it in her sternum, in the marrow of her bones, in the slow golden pulse of the valves along her neck. She walked to the center. There was no holographic console, no touchscreens, no council interface. Just a heavy, analog control ring carved from oxidized bronze and reinforced polymer, surrounded by manual override levers, pressure dials, and physical valve wheels. The original architects hadn't built this for algorithms. They'd built it for hands, for breath, for balance. "You're here." The presence didn't speak. It resonated. The air pressure shifted, wrapping around her like a cool, deliberate embrace. The condensation on the crystal dome traced fractal patterns that matched the rhythm in her skin. Elara closed her eyes. The implant was dead, the digital bridges burned, but she didn't need them anymore. The Council had spent centuries trying to filter the atmosphere into compliance, to reduce a living biosphere to manageable data streams. But the planet didn't speak in code. It spoke in pressure drops, in thermal gradients, in the slow, patient turn of seasons. And Elara was finally listening without a translator. She placed her hands on the central control ring. The metal was cold, etched with worn glyphs that matched the terraforming logs Jax had uncovered. Atmospheric realignment requires somatic sync. Operator must mirror planetary rhythm. Unclay, a warning. A warning or an invitation. Elara gripped the first lever. It resisted. Heavy. Grounded. She pulled. Pain flared along her collarbones. The biofiltration valve surged, heat radiating into her jaw, down her spine. Her breath hitched. The lever moved an inch. Above, the city groaned. A deep, metallic shudder traveled through the platform, followed by a subtle shift in the air density. The sheer pressure in the upper atmosphere eased, just slightly, but it was enough. She moved to the next lever, pulled. The heat intensified. Her muscles trembled. Sweat stung her eyes. Each adjustment wasn't mechanical. It was physiological. The machinery wasn't responding to torque. It was responding to her. Her heart rate, her respiratory cycle, the neural biofeedback looping through her valves. She had to breathe with the planet, match its rhythm, surrender to the strain. Don't fight it, the resonance whispered, woven into the draft that swept across the platform. Let it move through you. Elara exhaled slowly, forced her shoulders down, stopped clenching. She pulled the third lever. The pain didn't vanish, but it changed. It became grounding, anchoring. The valves along her neck glowed steady gold, no longer straining, but harmonizing. With each turn, each pull, the city's frantic, tearing groan softened into a low, steady thrum. The air inside the spire cleared. The sterile ozone faded, replaced by something ancient and alive. She could taste moisture on her tongue, feel the settled tug of recovering wind currents against her skin. The planet wasn't just healing. It was waiting for her to finish the conversation. She reached for the fourth lever, the primary stabilizer override. A heavy impact shook the outer blast doors. Then another. Plasma cutters hissed. Shouted orders echoed through the ventilation shafts. Council breach teams. Commander Vance's voice cut through the comms, sharp and uncompromising. Sten Vance, step away from the console. You're compromising 200,000 lives on a delusion. Stand down. Elara didn't look up. Her hands stayed on the bronze ring. Her breath stayed steady. The countdown on her wrist terminal blinked in her periphery. 0844. 00843. Train Schleiss. 8 minutes. The doors wouldn't hold much longer. The shear was stabilizing, but the final alignment required a full somatic lock. One miscalculation, one break in rhythm, and the feedback would tear the spire's core apart, or burn her out completely. They'll kill you. Jax's voice echoed in her memory. If you start frying, I'm pulling the plug. But Jax wasn't here. The council was at the door, and the planet was breathing in her hands. Elara closed her eyes, felt the weight of the lever, felt the rhythm in her chest, felt the slow, patient pulse of a world that had survived centuries of poison, of denial, of engineered abandonment. It wasn't asking for a savior. It was asking for a witness, for someone willing to bleed into the machine and trust the current. She gripped the final lever, took a breath, matched the wind, and pulled. The lever didn't click. It sang. A deep, resonant thrum vibrated through the oxidized bronze ring, traveling up Elara's forearms, settling heavy and hot in her chest. The biofiltration valves along her collarbones flared white-hot, then stabilized into a steady, pulsing gold. The control ring rotated. Gears engaged. Somewhere deep in the city's underbelly, massive stabilizer thrusters disengaged with a sound like tearing titanium. The platform dropped, just an inch. But it was enough. Ethelgard drift was falling. The blast doors blew inward. Shrapnel and superheated smoke filled the entryway. Through the haze, heavy magnetic boots pounded the grating. Commander Vance emerged first, armor scorched, face carved from granite and exhaustion. Behind him, a squad of council enforcers raised pulse rifles, targeting lasers painting jagged red dots across Elara's chest. "Stand down, Elara." Vance's voice cut through the wailing sirens, sharp with a mixture of fury and something dangerously close to grief. "You've initiated an uncontrolled descent. The structural integrity won't hold. The sheer forces will tear the hull apart before we breach the lower atmosphere. Abort the sequence, now." Elara didn't let go of the ring. Her breath was ragged, sweat stinging her eyes, but her stance was rooted. "It's not uncontrolled," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her legs. "It's aligned. The atmosphere's ready. We don't need to float anymore. We need to land." Vance stepped forward, ignoring the enforcer's warning hum. "You're gambling 200,000 lives on a hallucination. The surface is poison. The Council's evacuation fleet is en route. Stand aside, and I'll spare you the tribunal. You don't have to die for a ghost." "There is no fleet," Elara shot back, locking eyes with him. The mentor who had taught her to read pressure gradients, who had warned her about neural drift, now stood on the wrong side of a lie. "Just a liquidation sale. You've been bleeding our altitude to force a panic, to make them believe falling is the only way out. But the planet didn't die, Commander. It adapted, and you've been too afraid to look down." A violent shudder racked the spire. Alarms pitched higher. Through the fractured crystal dome, Elara saw the city's outer hull groan under atmospheric shear. Panels buckled. Conduits sparked. Panic rippled through the open comms, screams, shouted orders, the frantic bark of evacuation protocols. But beneath the chaos, something else moved. The air inside the spire shifted. Cool, deliberate. "Breathe with me," as the presence resonated, not as a voice, but as a pressure wave that smoothed the turbulent currents. The fractal condensation on the dome expanded, weaving into the city's ventilation grid. The alarms didn't stop, but their pitch changed. The sirens harmonized. The structural stress didn't vanish, but it distributed, evened out, like a lung expanding against a sudden, gentle tide. Vance saw it too. His jaw tightened. Override the sequence. Manual abort. He lunged for the secondary console, fingers flying across the emergency keypad. The red abort glyph flashed. Esport initiated. Stabilizers re-engaging. Descent halted. Elara moved. She didn't think. She threw herself across the platform, slamming her body between Vance and the console. A pulse rifle discharged. The blast caught her left shoulder, searing through her suit, throwing her back against the bronze ring. Pain exploded, white and blinding. She tasted copper. Blood dripped from her split lip onto the oxidized metal. Her vision swam. The world narrowed to the smell of his own, the ringing in her ears, the heavy weight of Vance's bootsteps approaching. "Elara." Vance's voice cracked. He lowered the rifle, face pale. "You stubborn fool." She didn't let him finish. Her good hand, shaking violently, reached for the abort lever, not to press it, to break it. She wrenched it sideways, muscles screaming until the safety latch snapped. The console sparked, fizzled, and died. Undersclack abort cancelled. Descent continuous. Undersclack her shoulder burned. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but the valves along her neck and collarbones flared again. Not gold now. Brilliant, blinding white. They weren't just monitoring anymore. They were conducting. The planetary frequency, the slow, ancient rhythm of recovering soil, of clean wind, of unfiltered rain, flooded through her nervous system, bypassing the dead implant, routing directly into the spire's core. The control ring hummed. The levers locked into place. The city's descent wasn't a fall. It was a guided exhale. The hull shuddered one last time. Then, silence. Not the silence of death. The silence of passage. The miasma below, thick and churning for centuries, began to part. Not from thrusters, from pressure, from breath. Elara dragged herself up, gripping the ring with her good arm, eyes fixed on the fractured dome above. The violet smog thinned, torn, ripped open by an updraft of clean, cool air. And then, light. Real, unfiltered golden sunlight pierced the haze, striking the spire's crystal dome, scattering prisms across the platform. It washed over her face, warm and heavy. Through the clearing veil, the surface revealed itself. Not ash, not ruin, green. Vast, rolling canopies of recovered forest. Silver rivers cutting through fertile valleys. Clouds drifting lazily over a living world. Vance lowered his rifle completely. The enforcers stood frozen. The comms crackled with stunned silence, then a single broken transmission from the bridge. Hull integrity holding. Atmospheric toxicity, as seen endo. Nominal. As sinks. We're below the layer. Elara closed her eyes. The pain in her shoulder was a distant thrum. The valves cooled to a soft, steady glow. She wasn't alone. The air hummed around her, patient and vast. You did it. The resonance whispered, woven into the sunlight, into the wind, into the breath in her lungs. She smiled. She smiled, blood and sweat on her lips, and whispered back, "We're home." The descent slowed. The city settled. And for the first time in centuries, Ethelgard Drift didn't float above the world. It touched it. The descent didn't end with a crash. It ended with a sigh. Ethelgard Drift settled onto the reclaimed plateau with a deep tectonic groan. The landing struts compressing into the resilient soil like roots finding purchase after centuries of suspension. The shuddering stopped. The alarms faded into a low, steady hum. Elara remained at the control ring, knuckles white, breath ragged, until the vibration in the floor shifted from strain to stability. The city wasn't floating anymore. It was grounded. The weight of the sky had finally been traded for the weight of the earth. She dragged herself to the edge of the platform. Through the fractured crystal dome, the sky was no longer a bruised violet. It was clear, azure. Sunlight poured through in unfiltered shafts, warming the cold metal of the spire, catching on dust motes that danced in the clean air. Below, the once toxic miasma had parted completely, revealing a landscape of sweeping green canopies, silver rivers cutting through fertile valleys, and soil dark with recovered biomass. The atmospheric scrubbers, starved of poison, automatically rerouted to maintenance mode. On her wrist terminal, the toxicity readout blinked once, then displayed a word Elara hadn't seen since childhood archives, "Hashternominal." He's Hashter, not just safe. Alive. The pressure differentials stabilized. The thermal gradients balanced. The city's artificial lungs finally exhaled, syncing with a world that had been breathing all along. The comms erupted, but not with panic, with disbelief. Bridge officers reported stabilizer lock, hull integrity holding, external pressure matching internal life support. Evacuation manifests dissolved into static. The Council's doctrine, drilled into every citizen for generations, shattered in real time. Commander Vance stood near the shattered blast doors, armor scorched, rifle lowered. He didn't issue orders. He just watched the green horizon, his face pale with the weight of a lie finally exposed. Around the city, maintenance hatches hissed open. Engineers, medics, civilians, hundreds of them, stepped onto the observation gantries, drawn by the light, by the clean air, by the impossible truth pressing against their skin. No one ran for the shuttles. They just stood there, breathing. The authority that had kept them suspended in fear evaporated like condensation in sunlight. There was no tribunal, no re-education, just a collective, silent realization that the ground had been waiting. Elara closed her eyes. The neural tap was dead. The implant was a cold scar at the base of her skull. But the presence wasn't gone. It had changed. She could feel it in the cool draft slipping through the spire's vents, in the faint scent of damp earth and crushed pine, in the steady, ancient rhythm that no longer required a machine to translate. She only Xiao wasn't a signal anymore. She was the atmosphere. She was the wind moving through the canopy, the pressure holding the clouds, the moisture pooling in the recovering soil. Elara wasn't the only one who could hear her now. The city itself was sinking. Biofiltration valves across Sector 4, 7, 12 all of them were pulsing in harmony, no longer fighting the environment, but matching it. The ghost had become the world, and Elara was just a woman standing in it, finally allowed to rest. The isolation that had defined her life, the desperate need to be the sole bridge between machine and sky, dissolved. She didn't need to carry the frequency alone. It was everywhere. It always had been. Heavy boots echoed on the grating. Elara turned. Jack stood at the platform's edge, face smudged with soot, a fresh bruise blooming along his jaw, but his eyes were clear. The compliance collar was gone, discarded somewhere in the mid. He didn't say anything at first, just walked over, handed her a canteen of clean water, and leaned against the bronze ring beside her. "Told you chasing ghosts gets you killed," he muttered, but there was no heat in it, only awe. Elara took a slow drink, the water cool and sharp. "They're not ghosts anymore," she said. "They're just air." Jax looked out at the horizon, shoulders dropping as decades of tension bled out of him. "So what now? We rebuild? We farm? We actually live down here?" Elara nodded, watching the sunlight catch the river below. "We listen. That's all we ever had to do." Hours later, Elara stood alone on the highest observation deck. The city hummed beneath her, but the sound was different now. Not mechanical, organic, like a heartbeat syncing with the tide. Her biofiltration valves were dimmed, resting at a soft, steady amber. The pain in her shoulder was wrapped, the burn healing into a quiet ache. She didn't need to monitor the pressure anymore. She just felt it. Then, the first drop fell. Cool, precise, striking her cheek like a promise. Then another, and another. Rain. Real rain. It washed over the spire, over the city, over the recovering world below, drumming a gentle rhythm against the metal and glass. Elara closed her eyes. She tilted her face to the sky, let the water trace the lines of her jaw, and whispered, so softly it was almost lost in the downpour, "I see you." The wind shifted. The clouds parted, and the air answered, not with words, with breath, with life, with home. The world hadn't needed saving. It had only needed someone willing to stop filtering it out.
Thank you for watching. Join Stellar Paradox. New stories every week, and some of them may already be watching you.